Japanese pilots believed their night raids were untouchable. They moved through darkness with confidence, knowing American defenses relied on sight, not sensors. But one night in the Pacific, a squadron of Japanese aircraft encountered something they did not expect. An American radar station that seemed to detect them with impossible accuracy and a strange silent pulse in the sky that no one could explain. Night over the Pacific carried a stillness found nowhere else on Earth. The sky stretched outward in a vast, moonlit expanse, scattered with clouds that drifted like slow-moving islands. Far below, the ocean reflected thin streaks of silver, broken only by the gentle rise and fall of the swells. Japanese pilots preferred these nights, the calm, the darkness, the sense that they moved unseen across endless space. On this particular night, a formation of Japanese bombers and their escort fighters traveled toward an isolated American airstrip. Their mission was standard: approach under the moonlight, strike fuel depots and radar huts, disappear into the clouds before anti-aircraft guns could react. They had done similar raids many times and believed they understood exactly how American defenses worked. They were wrong. Far beneath their flight path, at the edge of a remote island, an American radar team monitored a quiet screen filled with soft green glow. The equipment was crude compared to later technology, noisy, imprecise, and sensitive to atmospheric distortion. But the operators had grown skilled in interpreting its shifting lines and faint echoes. Around midnight, a weak distortion appeared at the edge of the radar sweep. It flickered once, then vanished. Seconds later, it returned, stronger, clearer, more rhythmic. The senior operator leaned forward. "That's no weather return," he murmured. Before he could confirm the reading, something extraordinary happened. A faint pulse of light, barely visible, almost imagined, appeared high in the sky above the island. It was not lightning. It carried no sound. It lasted less than a heartbeat. But 3 different American radar operators saw it reflected faintly on the metal edges of their screens. And far above them, Japanese pilots felt a sudden unease they could not explain. Their formation continued forward, unaware that the Americans were tracking them with unusual clarity. The radar team adjusted dials, refined bearings, and traced the incoming path with remarkable precision. Within minutes, American gunners were awake, anti-aircraft crews were ready, and the night sky around the island seemed to shift, not in light or color, but in intention. The Japanese formation had flown dozens of missions. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, they were heading into an encounter they did not understand. One shaped not only by radar, but by a strange, unexplained phenomenon in the upper sky. The Japanese formation advanced steadily across the moonlit Pacific, their aircraft humming in disciplined unison. The bombers flew at a measured altitude, flanked by experienced fighter pilots who had navigated these routes many times before. They trusted the night. They trusted the shadows. And they trusted their knowledge of American defenses, primitive, predictable, and often slow to respond. Below them, the island remained dark. No searchlights swept the sky, no guns fired, and no engines stirred on the runway. From a Japanese perspective, everything looked exactly as it should. Yet high above their flight path, something subtle shifted. A faint shimmer, barely more than a ripple, glided across a thin veil of cloud. It resembled moonlight at first, the kind of soft glow produced when light encounters uneven moisture in the air. But this shimmer carried a slow, rhythmic pulse, appearing for a fraction of a second and then fading into darkness. It was gentle, not bright enough to illuminate anything, but distinct enough to catch the corner of an observant eye. One Japanese pilot noticed. He lifted his gaze for only a moment, wondering if the reflection came from another aircraft's canopy. But the formation remained steady, each plane in its assigned position. The glow had come from nowhere he could identify. He said nothing. The silence of a night flight left no room for speculation. Far below, the American radar station captured its first steady return. The faint distortion that had flickered moments earlier now appeared more consistently, sliding inward along the radial sweep like a growing echo on still water. The senior operator leaned closer, eyes narrowing at the rhythmic pulses. "There it is again," he whispered. Range increasing, bearing steady. The equipment crackled softly, responding to the adjustment of dials. Radar at this stage in history was still experimental, prone to false signals and atmospheric interference. But tonight, the returns were unusually clean, almost too clean. No static clouds, no ghost signals, no irregular waves. The Japanese aircraft appeared as if outlined against an invisible backdrop. The operator made a notation. Outside the small bunker, anti-aircraft crews stood beside their guns, waiting for orders. They had grown accustomed to the uncertainty of radar reports. Sometimes the equipment saw ghosts, sometimes it missed entire formations. But tonight, something in the operators' voices conveyed quiet certainty. "We've got them," the senior operator said. Back in the sky, the Japanese pilots tightened formation as they neared their target. They expected the element of surprise to be on their side. Their night operations relied on silence and the assumption that American radar could not track them accurately. Then the faint shimmer appeared again. This time it glowed just above the lead bomber, soft, curved, and gone before any man could fully process what he had seen. One pilot shifted in his seat, feeling the oddest sense that something in the night sky itself had acknowledged their presence. Radio discipline kept them silent. No hay del chatter, no speculación. But the feeling lingered. At the radar station, the operators watched the screen with growing focus. Their equipment, usually cluttered with interference, displayed a steady pulse. The incoming aircraft seemed to cast a stronger reflection than expected, almost as if the atmosphere itself had become more conductive. Elevation holding, speed constant. The operator paused, and the signal's too strong for this range. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But the Japanese formation was no longer hidden. It was being tracked with a clarity the Americans had never achieved before. A quiet tension spread through the bunker. Outside, gunners prepared. Above, the shimmer pulsed once more. And for the first time, the Japanese pilots felt the night tightening around them, as though something they could not see was watching every move. The Japanese formation continued its steady approach across the open night sky, moving with the confidence of crews who had completed missions like this many times before, although several pilots sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere surrounding them, as if the familiar darkness had taken on a faint, shimmering quality that made the air feel heavier and the moonlight slightly distorted in a way they could not quite identify, despite all their experience flying long-distance night operations. Over the Pacific, far below, inside the dimly lit radar bunker on the American-held island, the operators leaned closer to their screens as the faint echo they had observed earlier returned with surprising clarity, forming a steady, rhythmic signal that moved inward across the circular sweep in a way that suggested not only the presence of aircraft, but also an unusually strong reflection that did not match the typical signatures they were used to seeing during nighttime atmospheric conditions. The senior operator, a man who had spent countless hours studying the strange behavior of early radar equipment, adjusted the sensitivity knob with the slow precision of someone who understood exactly how fragile the signal could be. Yet he immediately noticed that this return remained far too stable to be mere weather interference or a drifting atmospheric anomaly, especially considering the quiet state of the surrounding skies and the absence of thunderclouds that could have produced false readings. What made the situation feel even more unusual was the quiet pulse of light that had appeared moments earlier in the upper atmosphere. A soft, almost imperceptible shimmer that reflected across the metal casing of the radar equipment and created the brief illusion of a secondary glow on the screen itself, something the operators had never encountered in previous night watches. Although none of them could explain it, each man sensed that the shimmering pulse and the unexpectedly strong radar return felt connected in a way that defied the usual explanations they relied on when their instruments behaved unpredictably, especially during humid nights when the atmosphere frequently distorted distant signals. Meanwhile, the Japanese pilots maintained formation, unaware of the level of precision with which the Americans were now tracking them. Yet several of them continued to glance toward the faintly glowing streak of haze that drifted across the sky, which appeared to pulse in a slow, rhythmic manner that felt almost synchronized with the subtle vibrations running through their aircraft, creating a sensation that the very air around them was responding to their movement. This shimmering effect was too soft to be considered a threat and too vague to be reported over the radio. Yet it lingered in their peripheral vision and created the uneasy impression that the darkness above them had become slightly more watchful than it should have been. Back in the bunker, the radar operator called out the updated range and bearing, speaking with a calm certainty that surprised even the gun crews outside, who were accustomed to receiving hesitant, fragmented reports from radar systems that often struggled to differentiate between aircraft, weather, and overlapping reflections. Tonight, however, the echo moved with such clarity that the operators felt as if they were watching a deliberate, unmistakable path being drawn directly toward the island, giving them the rare advantage of preparing their defenses well before the incoming formation could attempt to strike. One operator, who had been studying the intensity of the returning signal, remarked quietly that the aircraft seemed to be reflecting far more energy than expected for their size and distance, almost as if something in the upper layers of the atmosphere was amplifying the radar beam in a way he had never seen before, a phenomenon that might have been dismissed as imagination if not for the soft pulsation of light they had witnessed earlier. Above the ocean, the Japanese formation continued without alteration, unaware that their position had been revealed with unprecedented accuracy, and unaware as well that the faint shimmering pulse that floated across the night sky was becoming a quiet, unspoken presence that none of them understood, yet all of them subconsciously acknowledged. The night remained calm, the ocean below undisturbed, yet the air between the two forces had begun to change, carrying with it a sense that something unseen was guiding the encounter toward a confrontation neither side fully anticipated. The Japanese formation pressed onward, maintaining the smooth precision that had defined their night operations throughout the war, although several pilots began to sense an unusual tension forming in the atmosphere around them. A tension that did not come from enemy fire or mechanical strain, but rather from the subtle awareness that the night sky was behaving in ways they could not fully understand. The shimmering pulse that had appeared earlier returned once more, drifting across a thin cloud layer with a faint, almost graceful movement, creating an impression that the light itself had traveled from a higher altitude rather than originating from the aircraft below, which unsettled the pilots in a way they could not easily articulate. Their mission had always been straightforward: approach silently, strike quickly, and disappear into the darkness before American gunners could respond, relying on the belief that American radar struggled to detect low-flying aircraft approaching from certain angles over water. For months, this tactic had worked with near-perfect success, giving the Japanese crews a sense of confidence that bordered on certainty. Yet tonight, a subtle change in the air told them that something was different. They felt it first in the formation. A small vibration began running through several aircraft. Not a mechanical vibration, but a faint trembling caused by shifting air currents that had not been present earlier in the night. The vibrations were too gentle to cause alarm, but they suggested a change in atmospheric conditions, the type of change that experienced pilots instinctively noticed even when they did not speak of it. The shimmering pulse reappeared at the edge of their vision, reflecting momentarily off a canopy frame before dissolving into darkness, as if acknowledging their presence without revealing its purpose. Below them, the American radar operators watched the echo on their screens grow steadily stronger, moving with a consistency that caused the senior operator to adjust his calculations with increasing confidence. He noted that the return was unusually sharp, as if the radar waves were bouncing off a surface far more reflective than typical aircraft skin, which made the detection far easier than it should have been for such an early radar system. He mentioned this observation quietly to the second operator, who responded with a slow nod, aware that they were witnessing a behavior the equipment rarely exhibited, especially at night when atmospheric interference often rendered their readings unreliable. Outside the radar bunker, American gun crews prepared their stations with deliberate calm, guided by the unmistakable certainty in the operators' voices. They felt no immediate fear, only the steady focus that accompanied any nighttime engagement. Yet even they sensed an unusual heaviness in the air, as though the night had taken on a density that made every sound feel slightly muted and every movement slightly slower. Up in the sky, the Japanese pilots finally began to notice the change more clearly. Their formation felt tighter, not because they were flying closer, but because the air around them seemed to compress in subtle waves, altering the normal spacing between aircraft. This sensation made it harder to maintain the fluidity they relied on, and several pilots adjusted their controls with small, unconscious corrections, attempting to counterbalance the strange shift in airflow. The shimmering light, which appeared again in a soft arc above the lead bomber, made one of the escort pilots exhale slowly, as though something unseen had brushed across his awareness. Despite their discipline, the pilots began to feel an unspoken concern that the Americans might be waiting for them, a notion that felt unreasonable based on their previous successes, but nevertheless persisted in their minds. Their instincts, sharpened by experience, told them that the night was no longer neutral. It was becoming something else, something watchful, something almost aware. Meanwhile, the radar echo grew sharper, the operator's confidence solidified, and the gunner's readiness intensified. The Japanese formation continued forward because they had no reason to deviate. Yet every man aboard felt the subtle weight of an approaching confrontation, shaped not only by technology and tactics, but also by an element of the night sky that none of them could identify, yet all sensed in the silence around them. On the island below, where the coastline blended into the soft darkness of the Pacific night, the American radar operators continued to track the incoming formation with a clarity that felt almost unnatural, especially for equipment that often struggled to distinguish genuine aircraft from drifting atmospheric noise. The echo on the screen remained sharp and unwavering, moving in a clean arc that looked less like a typical radar return and more like the trace of an object illuminated by a guiding hand, a detail that caused the senior operator to pause several times as he verified the readings with a level of focus that bordered on disbelief. He whispered to his assistant that the signal strength appeared to fluctuate in harmony with the faint pulse they had witnessed earlier, creating the strange impression that the sky itself was amplifying the radar waves. Outside the bunker, American gunners stood beside their anti-aircraft positions, watching the horizon for any sign of the incoming threat. They trusted the radar operators, but many of them also sensed an unfamiliar thickness in the air, a sensation that made the night feel heavier and more deliberate, as though something unseen and vast lingered high above the island, shaping the movement of the clouds and the gentle flow of the wind. These men had spent countless nights waiting for the sudden eruption of enemy aircraft, Yet tonight felt different, not because of fear, but because of an almost intuitive sense that they were witnessing the beginning of an encounter shaped by forces beyond their ordinary expectations. As the Japanese formation approached closer, the shimmering pulse in the sky appeared again, drifting across the upper atmosphere in a soft arc that illuminated a thin layer of haze. From the perspective of the Japanese pilots, the glow seemed not to radiate outward but to bend gently, almost as if responding to their motion, creating a subtle alteration in the light that made the night sky feel alive in a quiet, distant way. Several pilots glanced upward, each one struggling to determine whether the faint pulse was a reflection from the moon, a distant cloud, or something else entirely. Yet none of them broke radio discipline to discuss it, choosing instead to trust their training and their mission. Inside the bunker, the senior operator relayed updated bearings to the anti-aircraft crews, who adjusted their aim with calm precision. The crews understood that early radar systems were never this consistent, especially not during coastal humidity, which often caused the radar signals to scatter unpredictably. Yet tonight, every sweep of the beam produced clear, rhythmic responses that reveal the altitude, speed, and direction of each approaching aircraft with an accuracy that felt impossible to deny. The operator could not explain why the equipment behaved this way, but he felt a growing conviction that the shimmering pulse above the island had altered the conditions of the night air, creating a rare atmospheric phenomenon that made the radar waves sharper and the reflection stronger. Up in the sky, the Japanese pilots began to sense a subtle shift in the air around their formation, as though the night had tightened its hold on them. The shimmering pulse cast a faint glow on the edges of their canopies, making the glass surfaces momentarily glisten before fading back into the deep darkness. At the same time, a soft vibration passed through several aircraft, not strong enough to cause alarm, but gentle enough to create the uncanny impression that the air pressure had changed in a way they had not encountered before. These shifts forced small corrections in their formation, altering the smooth precision they relied upon. While none of the Japanese pilots could have known that American gunners were already prepared, they nevertheless felt a growing unease, a sense that their usual advantage of stealth no longer existed. They continued forward because their training demanded it, yet each man sensed that the night itself seemed to be watching them more closely than ever, responding to their presence with subtle motions that felt almost deliberate. On the island, guns were trained on the sky. In the bunker, radar operators tracked every movement with unwavering clarity. And above it all, the soft, unexplained pulse drifted through the atmosphere, shaping the final moments before contact in a way neither side fully understood. As the Japanese formation advanced toward the island, the pilots began to experience a growing tension that did not originate from any visible threat, but rather from the quiet realization that the air around them behaved in a way they could not fully explain, as though the night were subtly adjusting itself to their movement in patterns that felt too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. The shimmering pulse, which had appeared intermittently throughout their approach, drifted across the sky once more, gliding along the curvature of a thin cloud layer in a manner so gentle and faint that it almost resembled a distant reflection of moonlight, yet the timing of its appearance created the unsettling impression that it responded to the rhythm of their formation. The lead pilot felt the strange sensation more acutely than the others. As he monitored his instruments, he noticed a mild vibration along the wing structure, not the harsh vibration caused by engine strain or turbulent airflow, but a soft tremor that gave the impression that the surrounding air pressure had shifted in a way that subtly altered the aircraft's stability. He adjusted the controls with practiced ease, but the sensation persisted, creating a faint dissonance between what he expected from the aircraft and what the night seemed to impose upon it. This was the moment when the first hint of danger appeared. Far below, the American gunners received final coordinates from the radar bunker. and although they had no visual confirmation, the precision of the radar readings allowed them to lock onto the incoming formation with a confidence rarely experienced during nighttime conditions. The senior radar operator, whose hands usually trembled during uncertain readings, found himself transfixed by the clarity of the display, which revealed the altitude and angle of each aircraft with such definition that he felt as if the planes were illuminated by an unseen source. He whispered to the second operator that the signal strength continued to increase in perfect harmony with the faint shimmer above the island, a correlation he could not rationalize but could not deny either. As the Japanese formation descended toward attack altitude, the atmosphere thickened around them in a subtle but unmistakable way. It felt as though the night had shifted from a passive environment into an active presence, compressing the air just enough to disrupt the natural fluidity of their movements. Pilots who had flown these routes dozens of times exchanged small, unconscious corrections to maintain formation integrity. Yet each correction introduced a new imbalance, creating a slow cascade of adjustments that eroded the smooth precision they depended upon. The shimmering pulse reappeared again, this time not above them, but slightly ahead, reflecting along a patch of thin, drifting mist with such delicacy that several pilots looked toward it instinctively, unable to ignore the way it outlined the edge of the cloud with a soft, curved glow. The glow faded as quickly as it appeared, but the psychological effect lingered, creating a sensation that something unseen occupied the space ahead of them, observing their approach with silent intent. This was the moment the first Japanese pilot realized they were no longer hidden. He did not see anti-aircraft fire, nor did he detect enemy aircraft, but he sensed a new heaviness in the air, a heaviness that suggested their presence had been discovered long before they reached the island. The formation tightened without a word, as though each pilot sensed the same truth. The Americans were waiting. Below, the anti-aircraft crews stood ready, listening for the first distant sound of engines, although they barely needed their ears because the radar operators continued to relay exact positions with unwavering confidence. The strangeness of the night, the shimmering pulse, the unusually strong radar returns, the quiet pressure in the air, had created a rare atmosphere in which technology and instinct aligned perfectly, allowing the defenders to prepare with a precision no one had anticipated. As the Japanese formation crossed the final stretch of open water, the lead pilot felt a quiet shock spread through him as the shimmering pulse drifted one last time across the sky, followed by a moment of complete stillness, as though the night itself were holding its breath. Then, from the island below, the first American searchlight snapped open, carving a pale beam through the darkness and confirming beyond any doubt that their approach had been detected long before they arrived. When the first American searchlight swept across the sky, the Japanese pilots felt a deep and immediate shift in their understanding of the mission, because the sudden illumination revealed not only that their presence had been detected, but also that the Americans had prepared for their arrival with a level of precision and timing far beyond anything they had previously encountered during night operations in the Pacific. The formation, which had flown with such confidence only moments earlier, found itself exposed in a sky that now felt dramatically different, as though the night had turned from an ally into a vast and silent field where every movement carried unavoidable consequences. The searchlight did not hold them for long, drifting momentarily across the formation before losing contact, yet the damage was already done because the pilots now realized that the Americans had tracked them with an accuracy that could not be attributed to luck or coincidence. Below them, anti-aircraft guns opened fire with a rhythm that matched the radar readings so closely that the Japanese crews felt as though the barrage had been timed specifically for their arrival, guided by an unseen awareness that anticipated their position before they reached it. The sky erupted in long arcs of pale, tracer fire, which rose toward the bombers in slow, deliberate streams, creating a lattice of light that transformed the quiet night into a battlefield shaped by precision rather than chaos. Through this growing intensity, the shimmering pulse reappeared once more, drifting across the upper atmosphere in a way that felt both gentle and strangely intentional, as if it were acknowledging the transition from anticipation to engagement. The glow reflected faintly across the glass of the lead bomber's canopy, creating the unusual impression that the sky itself had contributed to the American awareness, although none of the pilots could explain why such a thought occurred to them or why the pulse felt so closely tied to the shifting conditions of the night. It was a moment that passed without discussion and without any attempt to rationalize it, yet it lingered in their memory long after the mission ended. As the Japanese formation dispersed under heavy fire, each pilot recognized that the Americans had employed a form of tracking that exceeded their expectations, marking the beginning of a new phase in the air war where the darkness no longer guaranteed safety. The radar accuracy, the timing of the guns, and the quiet, inexplicable pulse in the sky combined to create an encounter that reshaped their understanding of what modern technology, and sometimes the atmosphere itself, could reveal. When the survivors returned to base, they spoke of searchlights, of precise defensive fire, and of radar performance that should not have been possible at that stage of the war. Yet none of them mentioned the shimmering pulse, even though each man had seen it at least once, because they could not describe it without questioning whether it had been real or merely a strange artifact of night that refused to behave like any other. The Americans credited their success to training, vigilance, and an unexpectedly cooperative atmosphere. The Japanese, however, left the encounter with a quiet recognition that something deeper had occurred, something that made the night itself feel aware. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.